right, can folks hear me okay? Excellent. This is that moment where everybody gets to watch the professor fiddle around with technology while the, experts in the room are over there. Hi. Hi. Hello. My name is Josh Fulton. Thank you all so very much for coming to this spring history lecture from the Social Sciences Department. We want to, of course, thank the Liberal Arts Dean, Dr. Cindy Anderson, as well as the Social Science Department Chair, Aileen Donnersberger, for their kind and very generous support of this particular event. Thank you to all who came. Thank you to those who came for classes or who were, brought with extra credit and all kinds of things. We appreciate everyone for being able to attend today. I know for students in my classes, there's a attendance sheet circulating, so please feel free to make sure that you sign in. Today's speaker is Dr. Christina Abreu, and I have a few comments to state before we get started, and so I want to make sure that I get this right. Christina Abreu is an associate professor of history and director of the Center for Latino and Latin American Studies at Northern Illinois University. Her research and teaching focus on U.S. Latinx and Caribbean history, with a particular emphasis on race, ethnicity, and popular culture. Her work has been published in Cuban Studies, the Journal of Social History, Latin American Music Review, and the Journal of Sport History. Her first book, Rhythms of Race, Cuban Musicians and the Making of Latino, New York City and Miami, 1940 to 1960, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2015. She is currently working on her second book project, a cultural biography of Afro-Cuban boxer Teófilo Stevenson, which is under contract with the University of Illinois Press. She earned her Ph.D. in American Culture from the University of Michigan in 2012. Please welcome Dr. Abreu.
Thank you, Dr. Fulton, and thank you all for being here this morning. Those of you who are here for extra credit or you were otherwise encouraged to attend. I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible and share with you a little bit about my research project, the book that I'm working on right now, which is on Afro-Cuban boxer Teófilo Stevenson. So I'm going to kind of go through the talk and share with you a little bit about what I'm working on right now. So it was at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich that the world first met Teófilo Stevenson, Cuba's soon-to-be most famous fighter and amateur heavyweight boxing champion. The Afro-Cuban boxer was the son of British West Indian immigrants, and he dominated the amateur boxing world in the 1970s and 1980s. He remains one of only 3 fighters to win 3 Olympic gold medals, taking home the heavyweight titles at the 1972, 1976, and 1980 Olympic Games. But rather than abandon amateur sport in Cuba for what could have been a very lucrative professional career, boxing career in the United States, throughout his career and even following his retirement in 1988, Stevenson remained what was called a totally loyal Cuban, declaring his commitment to the ideals of the Cuban Revolution. So what I want to do in our time together this morning is share with you some highlights from Stevenson's career and make the case that by understanding his career, the rise and fall of his boxing fame, that following that trajectory helps us better understand Cuba since 1959. So what I do in my work is I study his professional career, the influences throughout his life, to try to better understand Cuban history since the Cuban Revolution of 1959. So first, let me offer some broad context. The Cuban Revolution took place in the late 1950s. It was an armed revolt that overthrew the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. In many ways, really, what it did was overthrow a half-century of corrupt leaders and ushered in the regime of Fidel Castro in 1959. So Fidel Castro is the guy, obviously not the map of the island, right? That's Cuba. There we have Fidel Castro. For over half a century since its independence from Spain in 1898, Cuba had struggled not only with corrupt political leadership, but also with widespread poverty, unemployment, economic inequality, the ill effects of tourism, especially things like prostitution and gambling, and thanks to the Platt Amendment, U.S. intervention on the island. And that was U.S. intervening on the island in the realms of the social, economic, military, political, and cultural fronts. These intersecting forces all contributed to the end of the Cuban Republic and the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. The leader of the revolution was Fidel Castro. Castro at the time was a young, charismatic, passionate leader who promised Cubans a social revolution. He promised things like land redistribution, right? So taking land from wealthy U.S. corporations, returning it back to ordinary Cuban farmers. He promised an end to racial discrimination, and he promised improvements and equality in healthcare and education. He also showed that he could and would stand up to the United States. By the early 1960s, he had found an ally in the Soviet Union, which set the stage for a Cold War conflict, wherein you have the United States representing capitalism and Cuba representing socialism. So that's a little bit of the broad, right, historical context to kind of understand what's happening in Cuba in the 1960s, what the Cuba is that Stevenson is growing up in, right? So it's a context of change, right? Of shifting, the shifting sort of landscape of life for ordinary Cubans, okay? So now I'm going to offer some specific, a little bit more specific context that's important for understanding the Stevenson story. So what happens is that the Cuban government, in this sort of political transition, the Cuban government bans professional sports in 1962. Castro argues that professionalism, meaning professional sports, he says it's a typical phenomenon of capitalism, since it's an exploitation of individuals and therefore has no place in a socialistic state. Since then, and with very few exceptions, Cuban athletes who hope to profit from their talents, they continue to face the difficult decision of having to leave their families to defect to the United States or elsewhere if they want to make money as athletes. You may be familiar with the stories of the many Cuban baseball players who have gone on to have successful careers and earn lucrative sums in the major leagues. Star players like Livan Hernandez, Orlando El Duque Hernandez, and Yasiel Puig. If you don't recognize those names, that's because I stopped watching baseball in the early 2000s, so I've dated myself. But there are other, right, Cuban baseball players in the major leagues, right, who kind of have to make that choice of, if I want to be an MLB star, well, I can't do that from Cuba. I have to leave to the United States. Less familiar, right, are the stories of other Cuban athletes, especially boxers, who, instead of leaving the island, right, made the choice and chose Patria, or homeland, over profits, right? And here I like to pause just to make the point that this is a very oversimplified dichotomy, right? That obscures the many factors that determine whether an athlete will leave the island to turn professional in the United States or somewhere else. I'll also point out for any students in the room who might be working on research papers this semester, here's where I'm also going to signal, right, my historiographic contribution, right? Meaning, if you've ever had a history professor ask you in your research papers, right, why does this matter? Why is this important? What's the historical significance? Here's kind of where I'm going to talk about what I think that is for my project. My research offers a first look, right, at the story of Teófilo Stevenson, a prominent and dominant Afro-Cuban boxer whose decision to remain on the island elevated him to the status of Cuban national hero and international sports celebrity. So it was a big deal, right, that Stevenson, right, at sort of the height of his career, he's offered a lot of money to come to the United States to fight, in particular, Muhammad Ali, and he says no, right? Because of that decision, he becomes a huge star and celebrity on the island, right? So he and Castro become really tight because of this celebration of the revolution and the sort of rejection of the United States. And through that choice, right, all the talk, right, about him set off discourses about race, about Black athletic activism, and about Cuban exile culture and politics. So now I'll get to what I think will be the main argument, or at least the narrative framing of my talk today and the larger book project that I'm working on. So Stevenson's status as a heavyweight boxing champion, national hero, and international celebrity achieved new heights with each Olympic gold medal that he won, so throughout the 1970s and the early 1980s. But he would then begin to figure less prominently and carry less significance in the Cuban imaginary in the mid to late 1980s as he entered retirement. And his life became characterized more and more by public controversies and personal tragedies. He died in 2012 in relative obscurity following years of alcohol abuse. Stevenson's fall from the glory days of the Munich, Montreal, and Moscow games mirrors and coincides with the decline of the Cuban Revolution. That decline really comes to a head with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, which ushered in a period of economic crisis in Cuba known as the Special Period. So the Special Period in Cuba was this moment in the early 1990s when there's widespread food and fuel shortages, there's food rationing, and there's also increased disillusionment with the unrealized promises of the Cuban Revolution. And so the point that I'm trying to make, or what I'm trying to argue, is as the Cuban Revolution gets going in the 1960s, 1970s, even the 1980s, right, things are going better, or at least there's sort of an upward trajectory, right, with Stevenson and the Cuban Revolution. We get to this point in the 1990s where kind of everything that the Cuban Revolution was supposed to be about, everything that it was supposed to bring to the island is not really working out, right? There's all, which is really an oversimplification, but there's kind of this decline. And that coincides, right, with Stevenson's also kind of fall from the pinnacle of his career. And so I try to look at where do these ups and downs intersect, and what does that all mean for understanding Cuba? The image that I've put up here also, I'll just pause to talk about a little bit because it's one of the most iconic images of Stevenson from his career. And when I first saw the image, when I was kind of getting started on this project, I did a Google search and this came up and I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. Like, this was probably after a fight. He had won. Castro ran up to the ring, and how awesome. Then I did a little bit of let me try to figure out where this picture, what's the real kind of history or story about this picture. It's actually a staged photograph. So it was taken by a very famous American photographer who comes down with special permission to the island to try to understand or capture for Americans what the island, what communism, what socialism in Cuba is really like. And so he meets with Castro, who then takes him to meet Stevenson, and they kind of stage this photograph of these two sort of heroes or pillars of the revolution, Fidel Castro and Teófilo Stevenson. So it was taken in Havana, and then this photograph hangs in Stevenson's living room. And so it's one of the, in his home, and so it was one of the images that I think says a lot about how important Stevenson was to the revolution. But then I think because he also kind of treasures the photograph, it also maybe tells us that the revolution was also important to Stevenson, right? So it's this kind of mutual significance across time. Okay, so any questions while we're transitioning? So that's a great question. He is a very complicated figure to try to hear in his own words what he thinks or what he says. I read a lot about I interpret a lot about what I think he thinks based on his actions and some of the little bits of things he says when he's talking to the press. However, I'm working on a new chapter right now, and that's looks at the late 90s, early 2000s, and he's retired at this point, and there's an up and coming boxer, and that boxer tries to defect to the United States. He's in Brazil, and he tries to leave to come to the United States, and kind of chickens out, and says, "No, I want to come back to Cuba." So he comes back to Cuba, and Castro bans him from competing on the amateur level, and kind of he's ostracized from sports, from Cuba, the whole thing. And Stevenson speaks out on his behalf, and says that this guy, he's not a traitor, he's not he just tried to do what he did for his family, and so he doesn't really comment negatively about the revolution directly, but he in his defense of this other boxer, he's kind of saying, I think, I can kind of understand why he did what he did. And so there's little episodes like that kind of throughout his life where he doesn't really critique or really support in some ways specific things or very directly. So you kind of have to, it's what historians kind of call like read between the grains, right? Kind of, you have to kind of piece things together and make an argument for why you think your interpretation could be, right, could be accurate or maybe convincing. Okay, so let me take you through a moment of Stevenson's, of sort of the peak of fame and revolutionary fervor. So we're going to talk about the 1976 Montreal Games. Public fascination during this moment centered on a potential matchup between Stevenson and Muhammad Ali. The hyped matchup really reflects the broader Cold War politics of Cuba and the United States, as each boxer came to represent the essentialized characteristics of their home country, the real and perceived sporting values associated with socialist and capitalist states, and the complexity of the Black sporting experience. Stevenson embodied amateurism, Patria, and revolution. Ali, right, stood for professionalism, profit, and capitalism. From these competing narratives emerges more than just a story about a seemingly reluctant Cuban sports hero and international celebrity. Rather, the story that unfolds also reveals a great deal about sport, race, and nationalism, the limits of performative loyalty, and Cuba's positioning on the global stage apart from its ongoing conflicts with the United States. Much of the discourse circulating in the popular press about Stevenson centered on his decision to remain an amateur boxer, rejecting million-dollar offers to fight Muhammad Ali as a professional. The narrative proposed that a potential matchup between the Cuban boxer and Ali would finally decide who really deserved the title of world heavyweight champion. When asked about fighting Ali and joining the ranks of professional boxing, Stevenson ended the line of questioning abruptly with the quip, "Muhammad who?" Later, asked if he could whip Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, Stevenson responded, "Why not? Nobody has two iron arms." He admitted on at least one occasion that he would fight Ali if, quote, "Olympic rules permitted me, but that he would not fight professionally." He said, "My country does not need the money, and I do not need it." In an interview that took place during the Montreal Games, Stevenson offered what one writer called a bitter denunciation of American capitalism. Stevenson said, "I have no interest in fighting Muhammad Ali. I think of him as just another professional boxer. I feel that I could beat him or anybody else, but I will never become a professional," he said, "exploited as merchandise." For many sports writers in the United States, Stevenson's rejection of professionalism and the fame and fortune that went with it made very little sense. So US sports writers, they really struggled to comprehend how Stevenson could say no to the money. But they tried to make sense of it. And that really said a lot about their understanding of the influence of Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution, and Cuban nationalism more broadly on Stevenson's positioning and his way of thinking. One writer argued that the choice was not even really Stevenson's to make, explaining that right now Castro wants him to remain amateur and fight for the greater glory of Cuba. He reasoned that, however, Castro might be convinced to change his mind. He said, "It doesn't take too shrewd an intellect to figure out that there is no better showcase than the heavyweight championship of the world." He said, this is one of the reporters kind of thinking out loud, "Should Castro ever turn him loose on the amateur wars, Stevenson could quickly become the Cassius Clay of the 1970s, from Olympic titleist to world heavyweight boxing champion." Sports writers and other commentators in the United States, they struggled to understand or believe that the Cuban fighters' allegiance to Castro and the Cuban Revolution was anything but forced or faked. "He could be folding the money and putting it in his pocket," one writer observed, "but he was still fighting with the word Cuba on his shirt, still dedicating his wins to Fidel Castro and the spirit of the Cuban Revolution. He might be the most intriguing athlete on the planet." Jim Murray, who was a very well-known, famous sports writer with the Los Angeles Times, lamented that Stevenson could be one of the greatest fighters in history, but he will never be the property of the honest bills, the mob, or the great white way. Instead, Murray said, "Teófilo fights for the revolution. He is the property of Fidel Castro." He cautioned, however, that unlike Alberto Juantorena, who was he was a track and field star. He was a runner for Cuba during the Olympics, and it's a kind of another interesting story about Stevenson. He's in Cuba in the 70s and 80s. There's Alberto Juantorena is they're kind of paired together. Stevenson, the boxing superstar, Juantorena, the runner, but they're also very different. Juantorena is white. He's very charismatic, very chatty, very outgoing, friendly with the media. Stevenson is a little more stoic, shy, reserved, doesn't really smile a lot. And so they were often compared with one another. In this case, Murray is saying that unlike runner Alberto Juantorena, who's the other star, Stevenson does not wave the flag, he says. His ideology is not so fiery. More to the point, another writer insisted that when speaking to the press, Stevenson repeats the party line. Similarly, again, right, in comparing the rhetoric of both Stevenson and Juantorena, another writer says, "Indeed, all of Castro's athletes arrived in Montreal with a full repertoire of Cuban revolutionary slogans. None of them expressed a thought of his own." Other writers centered Stevenson as an individual who made his own decisions, right? And so this is the, part of what I like to do in my writing is look at a wide range of writings in the popular press. So look at a lot of different newspaper and magazine articles, both in the United States and Cuba. Also, because I look at these different Olympics, I look at the Canadian. So for the Montreal Games, I look at a lot of Canadian newspapers and sort of compare, right? What are all these different people saying? At what time? Is there any change over time? Things like that. So while some writers were saying one thing, other writers centered Stevenson as an individual who made his own decisions, independent of Castro and free of the surveillance of the Cuban state. One writer noted that in an unsupervised interview, Stevenson insisted that money means nothing to me. Another writer noted, he was under no immediate surveillance in his conversations, and he could easily have indicated that he would indeed be interested in $1 million. But there was absolutely no hint of that. Some writers tried to reframe the speculation surrounding a possible bout with Ali, asking the boxer if he would reconsider his position if Castro requested it. Stevenson responded, "I'm sure he'll never ask. He knows exactly what's going on in the pro-boxing world, and so do I. If one day he asks me to fight a bout approved by the International Olympic Committee, then maybe I would do it. But I will not become a professional, and he will never ask." Stevenson worked to shut down the nagging speculation, adding, "It is no need to talk about what I might do against Ali, Frazier, or Foreman. I will never fight them. I am happy as I am." "I'm an athlete," Stevenson told the Montreal Gazette. "In professional boxing, there is no mercy. Money and profit motive of managers can drive an athlete into serious injury. Boxing is not beautiful when it is like that," he said. "I don't use boxing as a means to live." Stevenson explained that Cuban boxers do so well in the Olympics and other amateur competitions because of the efforts of their trainers and the revolution's support of sport. Because in Cuba, he said, sport is the right of the Cuban people. Later in life, when asked if perhaps he might have considered taking the money that comes with professional boxing, knowing that the funds could have been used to assist the lagging Cuban economy, he responded, "I would do anything for my country, but my country knows how to protect its own." So here we see Stevenson at the peak of his career as a representation of the Cuban nation and the values of the Cuban Revolution at a moment when Castro and the Cuban government remained firmly committed to revolutionary ideals and to their opposition to the United States. And here I've shared an image, so to ruin the story for you, Stevenson and Ali, they never fight, right? It never works out. There were all these sorts of proposals and kind of gimmicks arranged for like maybe it could happen, maybe they'll fight. There was one proposal that they were going to do a tour across the United States doing one round in 5 different cities. There were all sorts of things. An arrangement was never made, so it never happened. But in their more senior years, it turns out that they become friends. Ali, in his retirement, becomes very much a humanitarian and visits Cuba several times to bring medical supplies and other humanitarian goods to the island. Each time he does that, he's greeted and welcomed by Stevenson, and they become friends. They visit also with each other in the United States, and often they would sort of do these sort of mock bouts with these senior guys, kind of doing a pretend what could have been. And so this is an image from one of those instances where they kind of pretend to fight each other in a kind of what might have been if it had happened. Okay. Okay, so now I'm gonna fast forward a little bit and talk about sort of the fall, right? So we've kind of spent some time on the rise of Stevenson's story and his fame and his celebrity. And so now we're going to shift and talk a little bit about a moment that I think highlights the decline of his stardom. So Stevenson wins his third gold medal at the Moscow Games in 1980. He might have actually gone on to try for a fourth gold medal, but Cuba ends up boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Games, which was, a lot of factors, but essentially in retaliation for the U.S. boycotting the 1980 Games. So now, right, Cuba's boycotting the 1984 Games, and there's there's a lot of uncertainty about Stevenson's status, about his future. He's getting older. He's starting to lose fights here and there. He's appearing less interested in boxing. And then it's not clear if Cuba is going to participate in the 1988 Seoul Games. So there's a lot of talk. Is Stevenson going to retire? Is he still boxing? What's he going to do? Then, in July of 1987, news breaks that Stevenson was facing criminal charges in connection with a vehicular collision that resulted in the death of a motorcycle rider. The tragic incident, which took place near Stevenson's home of Las Tunas, fueled speculation that Stevenson would retire from boxing and not seek a fourth gold medal at the 88 Games in Seoul. In fact, right, the New York Times went so far as to report that Stevenson had indeed retired and that he had moved on to coaching. Manuel Guerra, who was the president of Cuba's National Olympic Committee, however, denied any forthcoming retirement announcement and noted that there was no connection between retirement and the accident. He said that's not true at all. He's still training and has not made any decisions. It's up to him, but he can still fight if he wants to. Stevenson spends 3 days in jail because of the accident before his release to await trial. Alcides Segarra, who was a Cuban boxing coach, confirmed that his retirement had not been made official. He said, "This is a decision that has not been decided," which sounds like what I tell my kids when they ask me for something where the decision has not yet been made, right? So we're still processing. Another unnamed Cuban official anticipated a retirement announcement, but offered a different motivation, arguing that no one really expected Stevenson to fight in the 1988 Games, though it had nothing to do with the motorcycle accident. Stevenson remained embroiled in legal proceedings, as Cuban officials admitted that retirement was the likely outcome to an accident that they revealed involved little less than alcohol. Though it was not clear at the time whether it was Stevenson, the motorcyclist, or both who had been driving under the influence. Phil Hirsch of the Chicago Tribune reported that Raul Villanueva, who was vice president of Cuba's national sporting body, found that Stevenson was not to blame when his car struck the motorcyclist, contending that the cyclist was approaching without lights and at excessive speeds. Villanueva reportedly explained that while he believed there was no legal fault, the matter would have to be settled in the courts. Fidel reportedly would not intervene in Stevenson's behalf. And so this is the really, this is the part that kind of blew people's minds, right? That you have this sports celebrity, this icon, gets in trouble in Cuba for an accident. And, if you know a little bit about Cuban history, what was really going on in Cuba was not often clear to the rest of the world, right? News sharing was not that common, was not that transparent, right? And so a lot of insiders wondered and questioned why do we even know about this, right? This could have been hidden, this could have been kept secret. Castro could have made it go away, right? But people are kind of shocked that it didn't go away and that it made its way public, and that then Castro actually comes out and says, there's nothing even I can do. It's up to the courts, right? This was a very uncharacteristic, hands-off approach. One report in the Miami Herald came to the conclusion that this was because Stevenson had fallen into government disfavor. Stevenson accepted no culpability for the accident. He said his point of view was that the motorcyclist was drunk, that he had been driving in the middle of the road without his lights on. He said, I didn't even see him. In the end, Stevenson is cleared of the charges, right? So in the end, he's found innocent. But, right, there's a lot of shock, right, about that this even went down. Remarks, and so there's a lot of, it's kind of it dampens, it sort of tarnishes a little bit his legacy, right? Remarks around Stevenson's decision or conversations around his retirement highlight a fundamental tension that framed much of his boxing career. That is, the tension between what might have been Stevenson's personal preference and autonomy in decision-making and what might have mattered more: national priorities and the collective decision-making of Cuban sports officials. So sometimes, right, in this talk, right, about his retirement, it was Stevenson was analyzing his possible retirement from boxing. Other times it was, we're still studying how he'll finish as an athlete, right? So there's, again, right, this sort of tension about what's Stevenson's decision-making, what's his choice, his personal autonomy, and then also about the collective, right? What's good for the Cuban nation? What are we deciding together? Then, finally, in July 1988, Stevenson, he's 36 years old, he announces his retirement from boxing. Reflecting on the decision, Stevenson says, I suppose I could have continued boxing, but sports has its different phases. You grow, you develop, and then you become a champion. I was a champion, and now I've decided to go on to other tasks. One big question remained. What other tasks would fill Stevenson's days now that he had officially retired from boxing? Les Matthews of the New York Amsterdam News reported that Stevenson had earned a degree as an electronics technician and that he would go on to work in that field now that he was retired. But a mundane career as a technician was not to be. For Stevenson, a purposeful life after boxing meant continued fighting outside of the ring in support of the revolution, showcasing the successes of the Cuban sports system and contributing to the development of the next generation of boxing greats. Bud Shaw of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution explained, Cubans believe that athletes like Stevenson and Juan Torena are indispensable as teachers and role models. He said, old Cubans don't retire and go on to sip daiquiris. They coach, train, motivate. It's part of the system. Eventually, Stevenson's reputation would suffer following his retirement due to various incidents that would come to temper his favor with the government. In addition to the motorcycle accident that we just talked a little bit about that preceded his retirement, other unsavory details emerge about his life outside of the boxing ring. Details that he was an alcoholic, that he had been divorced 3 times. In one instance, El Nuevo Herald, which was a Spanish-language newspaper in Miami, reported that Stevenson had even made a homemade bomb targeting one of his estranged wives. The effort failed, and the boxer's punishment was a temporary banishment to Las Tunas to work as a boxing trainer. One of the most controversial incidents surrounding his life took place in October 1999. A routine travel day for Stevenson that evolved into an international political spectacle. Stevenson had traveled to Washington, D.C. to attend the 2 million black tie children's benefit at the invitation of Muhammad Ali. Stevenson went to the event, and he was scheduled to return to Cuba the next day. But he did not board his scheduled early morning return flight to Havana. Instead, he was arrested on felony charges, aggravated battery and resisting arrest with violence, after he headbutted a United Airlines gate agent at Miami International Airport. The altercation resulted in the airline employee injured with a laceration of the mouth and having several teeth knocked out or loosened. News reporters described a messy scene. It took 4 Metro-Dade police officers, one using a baton, to subdue Stevenson. After spending a few hours in county jail, Stevenson posted bond and returned to Cuba via a charter flight. His arraignment date was set for the following month, though most speculated that it was not likely that Stevenson would return to Miami to face charges. What prompted Stevenson to act out at this moment was not entirely clear. Stevenson had reportedly tried to force his way past a checkpoint, arguing with a gate agent about boarding his flight ahead of wheelchair passengers. Alcohol appeared to be a factor. Miami-Dade Sergeant Stephen Leibowitz noted that the boxing icon, he said he reeked of alcohol, and the police report detailing the incident accused Stevenson of being under the influence of alcohol. Stevenson, however, offered a very different explanation. He reportedly told Trabajadores, which was a weekly newspaper in Cuba, that he had acted out, but that he had done so because he was triggered by the gate agent's disrespectful remarks about Fidel Castro. So he says that the gate agent starts to spout insults against the commander-in-chief, against our government, against all of us. I tried to ignore him at first, but when he went after Fidel, I had to say to him, "Don't F with me, because I'll kill you right here." The gate agent reportedly demanded to see Stevenson's ticket, but Stevenson refused to show it because the agent would not identify himself as an airport employee. Stevenson insisted that the headbutt was accidental, coming after he dropped his ticket on the ground amidst the confusion. So, I mean, right, you can just imagine sort of the chaos, right, of what might have actually gone down at this incident. And also considering, right, Stevenson's size, right? So he was of significant size, right? In the Cuban Weekly's framing of the incident, Stevenson was provoked in a bid by Miami's counter-revolutionary mafia to smear a Cuban sports star. So this was a period, 1990s Miami, right, when Cuban exiles, so Cubans who had left the island because of the revolution, because they didn't like the direction that Castro was taking the island, and by leaving the island they had rejected the revolution, were assumed to be a monolithic bloc committed to the overthrow of the Castro regime. So the stage here is really set for conflict, right? You have Stevenson, this icon of the revolution, coming up against, right, the gate agent, who is now become this representative figure of Cuban exiles in Miami who had left the island in rejection of the revolution, coming to physical blows, right, in this conflict, right, of, again, right, Stevenson standing in for the revolution and somebody else, right, standing for the United States and rejection of the revolution. So Stevenson, so this is another kind of instance of how Stevenson plays, right, as a representative of the revolution. Stevenson never returns to the United States for his court hearing. Cuban authorities reportedly stated that they would allow Stevenson to stand trial in the United States if they could be guaranteed that his case would be evaluated fairly. Circuit Judge Alex Ferrer was not surprised by the boxer's no-show, commenting that he was more likely to see Jimmy Hoffa in that courtroom than to see Stevenson. The result? technically Stevenson was now a wanted man in the United States. While the judge vacated his bond and issued a warrant for his arrest, it was clear that it was just as unlikely that Cuba would allow Stevenson to be extradited to the United States to face charges. So the airport incident raised questions about the details surrounding Stevenson's travels to the United States. This was a moment, right, where travel between Cuba and the United States was not easy. It often required visas, permissions, special exemptions for why you could travel. In particular, for Cubans to come to the United States, right, was not permissible in some of the ways that it was a few months ago. So, so a lot of Cubans in the U.S. at that time were kind of curious about, or not just curious, but sort of frustrated about how it was that Stevenson could come here and cause this big ruckus. The Miami Herald reports that the children's charity paid for Stevenson's visit, including his stay at the Capitol Hilton Hotel, but that he had arranged for his own visa. He reportedly spent one night in Miami with friends prior to his return to the island. Then there were questions about who posted the boxer's bond following his arrest. The Miami Herald reported that Stevenson's friends contracted a bonding company in Miami to pay 10% of the $12,500 bond, and noted that an official with the Cuban interest section in Washington, D.C., wanted to be very clear that Cuban diplomats in the United States did not pay the bond or provide the collateral. The matter of Stevenson's bond caused additional controversy because now that the bonding company was on the hook for the $12,500 following his missed court date, the bondsman reportedly tried to argue that Stevenson could not report to the United States, right? So they're trying to figure out a way, how can they get their money back? So they try to argue that the political climate is too hot because they were in the midst of the Elian Gonzalez saga. Elian Gonzalez saga was the story of the Cuban boy who was rescued at sea, fleeing Cuba for the United States. Elian becomes the center of a media frenzy and international legal battle for his custody. That Stevenson could so easily secure a visa to travel to the United States angered people in Miami. One letter to the perspective section of a Nuevo Herald asked, "How is it possible that so many people die trying to cross the Florida Straits in flimsy boats that sink or are sunk, and this delinquent former boxer Teófilo Stevenson travels to this country, and we find out because of his violent altercation at the airport and his momentary arrest." So, right, there's some people who are not, right, the celebrity and the star that he was in Cuba, right, was not necessarily, right, the same perspective that Cubans in Miami shared. And so I point that out because here's another moment where when I started this project, I thought that I was going to be writing a different story. I grew up and I had, my family's Cuban, and I had heard about Stevenson. And so I thought, oh man, this guy must have been so popular in with my Cuban family and other Cubans across the United States. And so when I start this project, I start looking at Spanish language Latino newspapers in the U.S. And it turns out nobody's even really talking about him. And when they do, it's usually bad. It's usually negative. It's usually to critique him. And so part of what I'm interested in this, and so for me that sort of changed the project. I was like, oh, this is maybe not a U.S. Cuban or Cuban American or Latino story. This is maybe a Cuban story that has different significance, right, for U.S. Cuban relations and also Latinos and Cubans in the U.S., but it's sort of not the one that I thought it was going to be. And so I think that's also important when you're thinking about your own work and your own projects, that you may start with a particular idea and you go kind of down that pathway, and then it turns out to be something totally and completely different, and that's okay, right? And you just kind of sometimes you let the story kind of take you where it's going. So I'll end just with a few kind of final thoughts. So again, right, I hope that these snippets from Stevenson's rise and fall have shown that there's a story to tell here about the Cuban Revolution. Understanding Stevenson and his rise and fall as a national symbol is a complicated task. To understand Stevenson is to also make sense of revolutionary Cuba and requires a measure of reconciling lived realities with the future that Cubans who remained committed to Castro and the revolution had imagined for themselves and for the island. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have about Stevenson or the revolution or just writing about history in general. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do you think that Castro really saw Stevenson as a representation of the youth born from his communist revolution?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, so that's a hard question. It's many facets or many different ways to answer that question, but I think that at particular moments, I think Stevenson was very useful to Castro's making certain claims about what he envisioned or what he was trying to do with the Cuban Revolution. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that Castro does throughout the 60s and the 70s, and even into the 80s and the 90s, is gives a lot of rallies, a lot of big speeches. Castro was a very charismatic orator and would give like hours and hours of speeches. And one of the speeches that he gives, so early in the revolution, also I should give you this context. Early in the revolution, Castro makes a speech in which he declares that racism and discrimination are over in Cuba, that they no longer exist. And so he says, because they no longer exist, because the revolution has declared them done, Cuba doesn't need any laws, right, or any legal restrictions making racism or discrimination criminal, right? So because he just says it's done. This, of course, right, in actuality is much more complicated, right? And of course, right, racism and discrimination still continues to exist in Cuba. But Castro is very proud, right, of this pronouncement. So that Stevenson is Afro-Cuban, right, is actually very significant because oftentimes what Castro does in speeches is point out, right, highlight Stevenson, make mention of his blackness, right, to say, look at this icon, look at this hero, look at his success, look at his skill, right, that never would have happened before because of racism and discrimination. But because the revolution did away with that, right, now he can be, right? Now Stevenson's, right, success is because of, right, the revolution's erasure of this sort of racist past. So in that way, right, I think that Stevenson's success is useful, right, to that kind of rhetoric. The other thing I'll note is that Castro was a lover of sports. He was he was an athlete himself, and so I do think that that's also part of why sports and athleticism becomes a priority of the revolution, and a lot of improvements were done, right, to make sports central to Cuban life. And so I think also there was this kind of affinity towards athletes and sports, and so I think it kind of intersects in that way. But thanks for that question. Oh, sorry.
What do you think actually happened at the Miami airport?
I think all of the above happened. I think Stevenson probably was drunk or hungover or something. I think probably the gate agent probably did say something, probably, right? I mean, it stands to reason, right? It's 1990s Miami, lots of Cubans around, yeah, probably all of it happened and created this sort of chaotic situation. But it is a scenario where if we had had cell phones back then, right, that would have been, right, there would be lots of, posts with, look at what's going on now, or looking what's happening.
First off, thank you, and thank you for the work that you do and are doing. And thank you for the inclusion of the Sports Illustrated Kids trading card. As a collector of those in my youth, I loved that. That was great. I had a question in regards to the post-revolution Cuban sport process. And just because of my own ignorance, if you came across in your work and research about if, there's the Olympic performances, but I would presume there's going to be some form of amateur performative circuit for boxers in Cuba. Who controls those spaces? Is it the state?
Yeah.
Who controls? Do they have concessions? How does the state make money on selling stuff at there? How does that all work?
Yeah, so what are the merchandise deals, right? So the Cuban sports system is nationalized. In the 1960s, Cuba imports coaches and trainers and specialists and experts from East Germany, from the Soviet Union, and they come to Cuba to kind of help Cubans develop their own sports system. In between Olympics, Cubans perform at the Pan American Games. They perform at other. They I write about music, so sometimes when I talk, they perform, but no, they compete at the Pan American Games. There's lots of sort of goodwill matches, even against the United States. So there is sort of this amateur international sports circuit that happens year-round. There's also sort of internal island-wide matches. And in fact, a lot of the talk that happens around Stevenson is that the Cubans say that he's not even the best Cuban boxer, right? That there's other Cuban boxers who are much better than him, but he sort of becomes this celebrity, right? And so some of the beef, I guess, amongst Cuban boxers and Cuban boxing fans is they're kind of annoyed that they still have to deal with Stevenson when there's younger boxers kind of waiting in the wings to take on his spot on the team. Attending the sporting events in Cuba is free, right? So everyone can go. There's no cost. Cubans are interested in sports, like attending sporting events, and so there is this sort of enthusiasm and interest in attending the sporting events. I can't tell you very much about concessions or things like, but there wasn't really like a merchandising aspect to it. I will point you to, though, there's an Anthony Bourdain episode. When he goes to Havana and his kind of island expert is a baseball insider. And they have to stop selling beer at the baseball games because there's too many fights and too many people are so like hot and heavy about their team that they're like, no more beer. But I don't know what they sold at the at the boxing ones. But certainly it's an island-wide system where Stevenson does become an official as part of the system and a boxing coach. But it was this idea that they want to identify Cubans who have athletic talent or athletic ability very early on, and then train them and support them. Stevenson was provided with, and other athletes provided with a state salary, because he was so good and so famous, he is also given a home, a car, and things like that to support his life and his lifestyle so that he could continue to train to compete.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, sort of building off the last question, was there any sort of use of these athletes in sort of pro-Castro propaganda, like saying, "See what the new regime is doing"?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally. You know, it wouldn't be framed that way, but certainly Castro. I'm sorry, Stevenson is quote unquote elected to the National Assembly. So he's you know, the equivalent of sort of a congressperson, right? So he's a congressperson in Cuba, and there's often extensive news reporting and spreads in different Cuban periodicals. You know, not just Stevenson, not just touting Stevenson's success, but using Stevenson's success to highlight the successes of the Cuban sports system. So in some ways, right, it is interesting and complicated because the Cuban system isn't really about the individual, right? So it is also this fine line of having this celebrity, having this icon, but having to wrestle with, like, he can't be more popular than Castro, right? Because that's a problem, right? And also, right, it's not about the individual, but it's about the Cuban people, right? And so Stevenson does kind of point that out, right? That, like, my wins are not mine. They're Cuba's. They're the Cuban people's. It's my country's wins. And so I think that's very significant. You wouldn't necessarily see like now there's a statue of Stevenson, and there's other ways to memorialize him and his legacy. But at the time, it wasn't like he wouldn't have been on like sort of the equivalent of like a Wheaties box, right? Like, right? Like that wouldn't necessarily have been. But he did get a lot of press and a lot of fame on the island because of how well he did in the Olympics in particular.
You know, actually, building off of Professor McIntyre's, I wanted to ask, do you think that in the earlier years, that rivalry between Stevenson and Ali, do you think that really what built that up was everyone really actually seeing a rivalry and, you know, potentially a fight between two different representations of completely, like, different governments? Like, one side being a communist and the other more like a democratic republic. Do you really think that that's what people were really seeing back then?
So I certainly think that was part of it, right? So I think you know, I mean, I think the question is like, how, you know, did everyone think that deep about it, right? You know, maybe not, but certainly it did carry that significance, and certainly people did talk about it in that way. It was also, right, about sports and about boxing and about, you have these two heavyweight powerhouse boxers who, like, we just want to see them fight. We just want to see who would win and who would really be the best. And then you kind of try to, you know, answer, why are we so fascinated with these two guys? Is it just about the boxing, or is it because it means something about the particular moment that we're in right now? And so I think it was all of that. But certainly people in the press, people framed it in that way.
If Stevenson and Muhammad Ali actually got to fight and they were both in their prime, who do you think would have won?
I have no idea. Boxing is one of those sports. I mean, a lot of sports, but you know, sometimes it's just one punch. I can tell you what a lot of people commented was, Stevenson. So the amateur bouts are just 3 rounds. Professional bouts, you know, are much more than that. They can be up to 12 rounds. And so the point that a lot of boxing analysts or experts made was that, you know, if Stevenson was going to win, it would have to have come, the victory was going to have to come in the first 3 rounds, or he was going to be toast, because he was just not used to the longevity of the length of a professional bout.
Did Stevenson leave any just documents or personal your primary source documents that you could use, or his family members? You alluded to a lot of just newspaper reports, but I was just curious if there was just.
I wish he did. To my knowledge, he was not. He didn't keep a journal. He was not a mementos sort of collector of artifacts from his time. He does have 2 children, ex-wives, and friends right across the island. So there is the possibility of doing some oral history interviews and talking to folks. I was actually supposed to go to Cuba in March with a group of students, and I was kind of going to do some of that work, and the trip just didn't pan out. But that is something that I'm thinking about, and that's also kind of framing the story that I'm trying to write. When I started out, the other thing that I was trying to do was I really didn't want to make it about U.S. versus Cuba, right? I didn't want to tell a story that was, capitalism versus communism or democracy versus communism, right? That's not. My first book was about the 1940s and 1950s because I didn't want to deal with the revolution at all because it's so thorny, and so kind of controversial in some ways if you take a particular position. And so I kind of didn't want to deal with all that. And so I was trying not to frame it in that way. But the more I got into it, the more I was like, well, how do you not tell the story this way? How can you even understand it without looking at it from this point of view? But that's part of the the other. The complication with and writing any kind of history is hard, but with biography is I wish he had left memoirs. I wish he had done full length interviews with folks. And the challenge with Stevenson is that he didn't like talking to the press. He spoke English, but with U.S. reporters he would pretend that he didn't, and almost always insist on going through a translator. The final interview that he gives to a British journalist, he's drunk out of his mind, and it's actually a very sad, tragic kind of interview and last kind of look at Stevenson. So it's really hard. You kind of only get these little moments, and then you always wonder, what was he thinking when he said this, right? Because it's for this kind of staged moment of this newspaper interview.
You said Muhammad Ali had invited him to D.C. for the event after that kind of was before the Miami event. Did they have a relationship after that?
Yeah, so Ali goes to Cuba in the early 2000s, and they still see each other.
So are there any documents you could grab from that of their correspondences and so forth?
So by this point, Ali is suffering from Parkinson's, and so there could be a lot of it. I would imagine would be filtered through his wife. But yeah, certainly. If there's the Ali papers, I know the libraries in Louisville. So yeah, that's certainly something to look at. Yeah, thanks.
Would you be able to speak to some of the complexities of the Afro-Cuban identity? I know that's a very huge topic. We could give a million speeches on in and of itself, but just so we can have a little bit of idea maybe of what some of the conditions pre-revolution were for Afro-Cubans and following revolution.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for pointing out, right, that it's. But yeah, I'll talk kind of generally. So prior to let's see, how far do we want to go back? So Cuba was a Spanish colony. There was obviously slavery throughout the island because of sugar, the sugar plantation economy. but unlike slavery in the United States, right, and this is typical of the Caribbean and other parts of Latin America, there was a larger population of freed slaves, free people of color, and all of that impacts what Cuban society post-emancipation was like, and then of course what revolutionary Cuba was like for black people on the island. Cuba, throughout the 20th century, was a place of division and difference between, for example, urban and rural. Havana was on the western part of the island, was urban, in many ways cosmopolitan, in many ways having aspirations to be like a New York, to be like a New Orleans, to be like a Mexico City, right, at this time. The eastern part of the island is mountainous, far more rural, fewer schools, fewer hospitals, fewer roads, and so the majority of people of color on the island lived right in the eastern part of the island in this more rural place, where they had less access to education, hospitals, ways of social mobility. Okay. So I guess the other thing that I'll say, because this is important for kind of framing what happens when Castro comes, as part of, Cuba had tried to gain its independence from Spain many times. It succeeds on its third try under the leadership of Jose Marti, who was a white Cuban intellectual, and Antonio Maceo, an Afro-Cuban general and sort of military person. And the way that they get black and white Cubans to come together to gain independence from Spain is they say, they make the case that in Cuba, there are no white Cubans. In Cuba, there are no black Cubans. In Cuba, there are just Cubans. And so that ideology really struck at Cuban, and kind of in some ways is sort of this fundamental tenet of Cuban ideology, of Cuban nationalism, of Cuban identity. That kind of fades away, right, in the Republic from 1900 to 1950 with the influence of the United States. So Cuba is independent from Spain, but still it's kind of a pseudo-independence. Cuba kind of becomes this neo-colony of the United States, where the United States is continuously interfering in the island's affairs. And so because of that influence, part of that is also the social, the cultural influence of, right, that we kind of have firmer boundaries, right, between white and black, right? And so Cuba complicates that also because there's this mixed race population where there really are not categories of white Cubans or black Cubans, because race functions on a spectrum, right, where there are all sorts of racial categories in between white and black. So all of that is to say, though, there was still racism in Cuba. There was still, right, discrimination in Cuba. When one of the promises, as I mentioned, right, was with the revolution, was that, Castro comes in and kind of makes it, he just banishes it, says it's done, it's over, it's gone. And what that does is, it doesn't allow then for Afro-Cubans to organize as Afro-Cubans. So Cuba in the early 20th century, there's a black Cuban political party, and then that becomes outlawed, because Castro says, not because I don't want black Cubans to hang out together, but because there's no need for it, right? What do you need? If there's no racism, well, then you don't need this black Cuban political party. So, there are, in the present day, like Afro-Cubans, have written a lot about the failed promises of this, situation. But there were a lot of gains in education. There's a literacy campaign in the early 1960s when Castro trains, not Castro himself, but his people, train teachers to go out into this countryside, go out into the eastern parts of the island, and teach everyone to read. Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates in the world because of this sort of literacy program. But I could go on and on. But that's it. If you want some reading recommendations, I can give you some too. Mm-hmm.
I know that we're at time for some
sorry.
folks with possibly heading to other classes and sort of that kind of thing. If others, have a question or two, would you be willing
Absolutely.
to
If you have a question and want to hang out, thank you all for coming very much.
Yes, thank you.